Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm here back with my friends Jerry and Kurt for another episode. Today, we're going to tackle the topic of memories, looking at how trauma can do some odd things to memories and how the memories can sometimes lead to things like re-traumatization and sort of at times keep us stuck in behavioral patterns. So fascinating topic for us to explore today. Excited that you chose to join us for this conversation. So I just want to wish both Jerry and Kurt, I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving, and to all of our listeners as well. We got some great comments coming in still, so please send them in. We'd love to see them, and a lot of people have given us some good show ideas as well, so we'll be attempting to integrate those in over the next few months too. So seems like we're building more and more momentum as we go forward. So that's always exciting to see. So if you're new to our podcast, we start every episode out with our bright, shiny objects. So these are things from three people that get obsessed about things in this field very quickly. These are some things that are on our mind that we've been really thinking about the last week. And as normal, I'll give us, start us out here. And for my bright, shiny object, I finally finished a book, because it's a big book, called Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, by Robert M. Sadowski. And I tell you what, Kurt, have you read this book by chance yet?
No, but I've read his other one, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Yes, this one I think it just has Kurt like drenched all over it. Really cool stuff. He takes a deep dive. I think it's around 500 pages. I was going through most of it in audiobook form, but really looks at human behavior from a neurobiological perspective. And two things really stuck out, have been my bright shine. Well, I guess three things, and I'll try to make them quick. It really stuck out with me in this book in a big way. One is, and we've talked about this before, sort of in our bright, shiny objects, does a great job from a brain perspective talking about the them and us phenomena, and really builds it. It's towards the end of the book and really takes kind of the 350 pages he's gone through at that point and build on that in a real cool way. The other thing that really also stuck out to me was how as I've been reading these neurobiological books for now the last probably 15, 20 years, it's cool to see these latest ones really including a lot of work on trauma and adverse childhood experience, the ACE studies. So whereas you that much maybe 5 or 10 years ago picked up specifically on trauma, when he talks about human behavior and again, sort of some of the like criminal behavior and other things, addiction, really positions childhood trauma as a big factor to that. And the final bright, shiny object that I've been obsessing about over Thanksgiving break is how he sort of breaks down in an interesting way, and he admits that we can't do this very well, is if you take a single act like a criminal act, somebody committing a crime, let's just say a robbery, trying to explain that behavior and how we can at best maybe put trauma in there, put in poverty in there. And he kind of admits that if we have as much information as we can possibly gather on the individual and the situation, we may be able to explain, at least scientifically back it up, around 40% of why that behavior happens. So it really shows the growth that we have to really understand human behavior in a real succinct way. So I wouldn't probably, if you've never read a neurobiology book, I probably wouldn't start with this one, because it goes real deep. And you kind of have to be a nerd to get to like page 500 of this book. But if you're interested in this topic, and you may have read one or two to give you some background, put this on your list, because it is a really fascinating one. So again, Behave, the biology of humans at our best and worst. So that's my shiny object of the week. Kurt, what's been on your mind lately?
Well, you got me thinking about Robert Sapolsky and some of his writing. And I think one of his great messages is when we're trying to explain behavior, especially that has values associated with it, you better be really careful.
Yeah.
Not be too much of a rush to make judgments about why things have happened or why they haven't happened. So I think that's one of his most powerful messages in all of the detail that he gets into in his writing. I have a quick one. I read a pretty interesting article about, the title of it, I think, was Why the Smartest Person in the Room Isn't the Best Leader. And really the point of it was, I think, how relationships are so important to leadership. And it was a pretty interesting study because it put some quantification to intelligence and what the optimal level of intelligence was to be an effective leader in any group. And it turned out that if the leader's IQ is way above the group, they're not likely to be an effective leader because they're not likely to relate to the group very well. And if you're too far on the other end of too low of an IQ, it's not likely that you're going to have effective leadership either. I took away from that how important relationships are to leadership and how you've got to be cohesive with the group and have the group's best interest in mind to be an effective leader. So I thought a lot about that after reading that article really quickly.
Very cool. Just always reminds me of Goldman's around the social and emotional intelligence and how so often that looked. And I think whether you're mental health or leadership, any interpersonal sort of work, it's such a critical aspect of it. And it's good to hear from my perspective, never being the smartest person in the room, that you don't need to be all that smart to be a great leader. So I'm still in the game, at least. So speaking of people, Jerry, what do you got for us today?
I was sitting and listening to you and thinking about IQ is probably not a good indicator of intelligence. And I'm thinking about Dr. Strange, about how smart he thought he was until he really had to kind of figure out that he wasn't so smart, right? So maybe you're smart enough to unlearn some stuff. That's the important thing. But one is just the role of gratitude as we kind of got through the Thanksgiving holiday, that we get through it so quick these days, going right from Halloween to Black Friday to buying things, that we kind of miss over this concept of, our capacity to be grateful for things in our lives actually has the ability to change our neurobiology and have us see the world in a different way. And that it's such an important American holiday, but it somehow kind of gets lost packaged between these two big kind of commercial holidays. So my bright, shiny objects was kind of just being with my family and with people I care about, and just being really grateful for the things I have in my life. So I also was reading a book really looking at the developmental science of early childhood by Claudia Gold, and really beginning to look at what is there about relationships that actually allow the transmission of attachment styles and coping ability from one generation to the next. We all talk about relationship, but this quality of those relationships that become really important. And one of that is our ability to not just to focus on behavior, but the meaning behind the behavior, the communication, and not from the adult's perspective, but from the child's perspective or from our client's perspective. We get so caught up in wanting to diagnose or wanting to kind of identify what the problem is, rather than being, as Kurt said 100 times in this, being open and curious to trying to discover the meaning of that for our clients. And so I think that, as we kind of talk about all these concepts, really it allows us hopefully to kind of integrate it and really not necessarily figure out what's wrong with our clients, but really about what's happening inside of them and why they're not able to kind of actualize what it is that they're so much capable of, to kind of look at that. So it's a good book. It just kind of puts together all the research and some of the concepts to go in, especially through a infant child parent paradigm. So one of the things I'm grateful for is my ever capacity to keep learning. So that's one of my bright, shiny objects, that as we teach other people about this, I have the ability to keep learning about it myself. So I'm not too smart, and hopefully I'm not too unintelligent either. So I have that nice blend of things.
You don't want to be more than 2 standard deviations.
That's right.
Yeah.
Stay in the middle.
I don't have to worry about that.
Yes.
I always surround myself with people who are smarter, as opposed to, right? Look at these podcasts.
Yeah. We'll see. We can all compete for who's the least bright of this. Yeah, as long as you're arguing that I might not be the least bright, I'll take that. So I'm not going to argue too much on that. So we had a follow-up question this week, and it's something we mentioned last week as we were really covering a lot of complex ground when we talked about the window of tolerance. And a couple of the concepts that we were throwing around were the roles of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions of our arousal system, and how that related to the stress response. And Kurt, we nominated you to take on this, probably a podcast within itself, but just helping people in case she had that same question going through last week's podcast. Just wanted to answer this question, as I thought it was a real good one.
You bet. I think to start with, I'll start out with another question, which is, why is this so important, or why are we so interested in this? And I think that one of the answers that I have to that is that so much of the research and literature is pointing towards the imbalance of the arousal system underlying so many behavioral health diagnoses and so many different potential problems that people can have. And so it's of great interest to a lot of people to understand this mechanism that underlies so much of the things that we tend to treat in this field. So basically the arousal system is comprised of 2 divisions, one parasympathetic and one sympathetic, and each one controls different aspects of the body's response. But basically this system is designed so that we have a method and a mechanism by which our body can get organized and respond to environmental events. Either those environmental events are things that organize action, or we take time when there isn't much demand to recover from periods of time when we have to engage in action to deal with environmental demands. So the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, or the arousal system, is responsible for organizing our action. So it motivates certain action, it mobilizes certain resources internally, and it shuts others down to allow us to be able to deal with environmental demands. If we don't need those functions, they go away, like digestion goes away when we need to deal with an immediate environmental demand, and the sympathetic nervous system shuts that down. Diverts blood flow to our muscles, it increases our heart rate, it gets us ready to take action to be able to deal with the environment. The parasympathetic, which an interesting thing I think about both of these is they're both what we would call tonically active. They're both happening all the time. They're just balancing each other out. And the parasympathetic division of the ANS is the system that allows us to recover from when we've had to use the sympathetic division of the nervous system, use our muscles. And so I talk about them as one is the gas pedal and one is the brake. The parasympathetic is the brake that slows everything down, and the sympathetic division is the gas pedal that gets all of our internal resources mobilized to deal with environmental demands. Well, that's kind of it in a quick nutshell.
We lost his sound.
Yeah, we lost Matt's sound. He's muted.
He's muted. So
I'll just I apologize for that. There's work being done at my office today, so I'm trying to knock the noise. But I think that was a great explanation. And you know, let me ask you this, Kirk, because one of the things I think I've learned about parasympathetic and sympathetic is, you know, you can kind of that the fight or flight, or the sympathetic part is always on edge of starting, and we sort of have that parasympathetic break. And when we see danger in our environment, that brake gets removed, and then we can immediately react to what's going on. Is that a good definition of how that brake is also used?
It is, and there are many neuronal systems that work that way, where you have, like, reflexes are designed this way, and that a reflex is primed to happen at any given point in time.
Yeah.
So the chemicals and the signals that are sent between neurons to make a reflex happen are tonically active. And then another set of neurons is just pouring essentially GABA, or an inhibitive neurotransmitter, onto that connection to keep it from actually firing. And that's how the balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic division of the nervous system happens, as each one is active simultaneously. And the parasympathetic is actually much stronger, has much more influence over our internal state than the sympathetic does. And so it makes a lot of sense, right? That we can tone things down when we need to. A lot of athletes will talk about when they get so high and so far up in their sympathetic activation that you can black out. And that is when the brake, or when the parasympathetic clamps down and really puts the stops on things from our arousal level getting so high that our bodies can't handle it physically. We have a fail-safe, and that is mediated with, we call it going vagal, because that's mediated primarily by the vagus nerve. So that's how those things kind of work together. And that's a relatively oversimplified view, but it gives you the basic functions of both of those systems.
Excellent explanation. So let's get into memory now, our topic for today. And I want to start out by asking you both, either of you can take this, but when we talk about a memory, it's basically sort of organizing our experiences and information we're taking in through our senses, which can be a vast variety of things. Would one of you want to give some background just on the basics of how our brain does organize these experiences?
Let's kind of broaden our concept of memory for a second, right? Every cell in your body has the capacity to use information to guide it in terms of functioning, right? So your immune system, when you get a vaccination, remembers something in your body and begins to build antibodies. That's memory, right? Or we talked about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. There's memory going on in terms of how to activate that. So memory could be a very broad term that could go all the way down to our DNA remembers things that happened in our ancestral past and recreates it, because it's helping us not necessarily adapt to the current environment, but the environment in which our ancestors lived, right? And then we talked about epigenetic changes, that there's memories that placed on the actual DNA about how it's going to be expressed, so that we become much more adaptive to the environment. So memory could be a very, very broad term. But for the most part, when we're talking about is that when we have some type of experience, a sensory experience, is that experience activates a certain pattern of neuron firing in our brains, right? That pattern then organizes the connections, so that the head theory is that fires together gets wired together. So that when we have an experience, the probability of a similar pattern, not exactly, because that's really important, a similar pattern is more likely probable to occur in the future. So that not only now is the firing pattern, but the connections get changed, and those connections begin to, in some ways, encode and store an experience from the past that we can use to, in some ways, make sense of our present and anticipate the future. So that when there's these firing patterns begin to increase the probability of a similar pattern happening in the future. When that happens with repetition, it encodes a certain network of connections that, when they're activated by something in the environment or something in the internal environment, it creates what we call a memory. And a memory, right, is that a memory, most people consider a memory to be something that we kind of recall, and that we have this verbal memory or an image or something in our head of something from the past. But we'll talk about memories are way more complex and multi-layered than just what we have traditionally considered what memories are, right? And so I'll stop there and kind of maybe ask Kurt and you to elaborate on some of that. But we'll talk a little bit more about what memories can actually also be that are related to trauma.
Kurt, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you basically, I think very well described two different kinds of memory that are important distinctions to make. One being implicit memory, or memory that doesn't have language associated with it, and memory that does have language associated with it. And so much more of what our experiences are implicit memories more than explicit memories. And I've heard of some writers explaining our brains in two divisions as the lower areas of the brain, which is the $1 billion computer, and then our frontal cortex, which is the $10 computer, and that it's so much more complicated at lower areas of the brain. And there's so much more integration that happens there than what we're actually aware of. And then we're actually aware of a very small portion of our experience. So we can then be having experiences where we're using the conscious part of our brain, or the cortex, trying to put some meaning to what's happening at lower areas of our brain. Or why am I feeling certain feelings? Why am I feeling happy? Why am I feeling sad? Why am I feeling anxious? And we're trying to put some meaning to that, and we put it together with what's proximal in time and what we think will be acceptable to other people as explanations. And so I think those are really important aspects of memory. Also, I think, Jerry, one thing you were talking about is that there are different levels of experiences that get organized, and an experience can have just a sensory motor part of it. It can just be an action. It can just be a reflex. And there can also be then an emotional component of an experience. And then there can be cognitive components of an experience. So I like to give an example in group trainings of a classical conditioning paradigm, where you can go over and in the room, I can turn off the lights and everybody's pupils will dilate. It's a reflex. If I walk over and say, hey, right before I turn off the light, and do that repeatedly, pretty soon people's pupils will dilate when I say, hey, not before I even change the light level. That's a memory. But that's solely a sensory motor component of that memory. There isn't much emotion associated with that. And interestingly, we can remember parts of experiences or experiences that have emotional components associated with them much faster and with much more detail than we can other types of experiences. Presumably because if things have emotional components attached to them, they're more important to us and we need to remember them faster. So there are many, I mean, memory is such a complex topic. I feel kind of not well prepped to even discuss it. It gets so complicated, and I learn more about it every single time we talk about it. And every time I read anything about it, I'm like, oh yeah, there was another thing about memory. Even going back to some of the episodes that we've talked about, we had a whole episode on attachment. Well, attachment is memory. It is our memories of previous experiences, and usually it's our first relationship that we're having memories of that then have an effect on every relationship that we have past then. In our episode about the stress response, and that our bodies can get activated by our bodies and our brains comparing current events to past events, and that's memory as well, and that can change our stress response. So all of these topics, while we're talking about them in isolation, they all work together in a way that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the implicit explicit memory, when I started to learn about that, it really made, in some ways, a lot of behaviors that I would see start to make sense, especially when my clients would kind of not remember the events that were going on in any way like I was remembering them. And I think one of the things that's important to remember in the criminal justice system, I think needs to struggle with this a little bit more than it does is the three of us could all watch the exact same, let's say a car accident happen. If you would interview us all 6 months later about what we saw, you may not realize we're necessarily even talking about the same car accident, because they're very subjective things at times as well. And one of the things that, especially as I work with medical professionals who are working with traumatized populations, to bring that aspect into it as well, I hear stories over and over again, and they're really powerful to me when we think about how we set up medical care. But a physician will be doing a pretty typical physical examination, like let's say maybe a pap smear, which is really a common part of any medical treatment that you get. And, before even maybe hands get touched or anything like that, all of a sudden there's this triggering response, kind of a re-traumatization. And from what it seems, and what I've learned about it, is how the body sort of holds these memories in certain parts as well. I know for some people, taking out of the medical situation, but being tapped on the shoulder might re-trigger sort of the trauma response. And so I'd love to talk about, I think we all do and think about memories are in our head, in our brain, but how they're also sort of stored in our body, especially sometimes when it's associated with trauma as well. And I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about how sometimes these implicit memories are stored and triggered through parts of our body too.
So let's talk a little bit about it from a developmental perspective, and then we'll get to a trauma perspective, right? Is that when we're born, we're not born with the verbal capacity to store information in words or store information in even episodes, right? What we are born with is initially the capacity to sense information, to have senses happen, have motor pattern reflexes, as Kurt talked about. We have images that we are able to kind of do it. And then what we begin to have these repetitive experiences. We begin to formulate generalizations from those experiences that create what has been called in the literature as working models or schemas or mental models, so that those models begin to in some way influence our new experiences, that we begin to become primed to react to the environment in a particular way. But there's still no words that are attached to those things. Somewhere around, really in the second year of life, somewhere around 18 months of age, the frontal parts of our brain begin to become more connected, more wired into the lower parts of our brain, and structures become online, so that the structures that allow us to somehow make a map of our environment, to begin to put it into some context, so time and episodes, that part of the brain begins to come online. So now in the second year of life, somewhere between the second through the seventh, really up through is that we begin to be able to organize our experiences into episodes. Then what happens is those episodes begin to get clustered around our sense of self. So our memories begin to get formulated. Now it's not just these sensory experiences and these motor patterns, but they begin to get formulated into discrete episodes that take place in a time and a place. And now they're organized into a more perception of myself being in those, which is called autobiographical memory. And eventually, somewhere around 2 years on, the part of my brain that begins to have language begins to create a narrative of those experiences, so that I begin to put my life history into some narrative, and I begin to look back and say, I can remember either being in that memory, or I see myself having that memory, but that really is a verbal memory that takes place in the prefrontal cortex, to kind of look at that, right? So there's a developmental process that's going on. But just like all developmental processes we've talked to about up to this point, they're all influenced by stress and the level of stress that we're experiencing, the state that we're in. So these earlier memories don't require us to be paying attention. So that I could be having a memory of something being encoded in my lower part of my brain where I'm not even paying attention to it. But the higher, more sophisticated, complex memories require me to actually be paying attention to something in order to encode it, store it, and later retrieve it, right? And so again, when you look at this concept of trauma, is that we know that stress initially, like everything else, enhances our memory. So if we have a certain amount of emotional arousal about a particular event in our lives, that emotion's actually going to tell our brain, you better remember that, that's an important event. And it actually becomes encoded to a great extent. But as that level of stress increases and it begins to overwhelm my capacity to feel safe, feel capable of responding, it actually shuts down the parts of my brain that are encoding these informations in episodes, in timestamps, and begins to record them in emotional memory or sensations or behavioral patterns. So when we look at attachment really is the infant and then the child's having to adapt to a relational context without language, and it gets encoded in what we call procedural memory. That's automatic behavioral patterns that get activated. And we don't really even think about them as memories because they just happen near the context to kind of look at that. Trauma really is, when it happens very early in life, prior to some of these structures being in place, right, is encoded without words. It's encoded in these physical sensations or these behavioral patterns or these mental models of the world. The world is a dangerous place. The world is insecure. I'm not good enough. All of these cognitive things that we have begin to get encoded. But later on, when those structures may be in place, but the stress becomes too great, it disrupts our ability to encode it in a verbal memory, in a kind of autographical memory, and we just get stuck with fragments of it, which is why this concept of trauma being, you have to have a memory of something in order to be diagnosed with a trauma is really problematic, because what we know now is lots of people have traumatic experiences that influence their behavior, influence their sense of self, influence how they feel, without having an actual cognitive verbal memory of why they're feeling what they're feeling. So what we end up doing then is we have this activated nervous system that's responding to something in the past without knowing it's in the past. But then what we do is we develop strategies to manage that state in ourselves that become those extreme coping strategies. So I then have this re-experiencing of, say I'm with somebody, and when somebody's angry at me, I feel I'm going to be abandoned and rejected, so that I'll do anything to keep you in my life. I don't know that's a memory. I just involved it. Now I get involved in really high-risk relationships that make me feel worse again, and then I have new experiences that keep So now not only do I have the old one that's driving this, but now I have new experiences that in some ways reinforce my sense of self as being bad, damaged, and to do it, right? And so lots of the treatment that we provide these days is about looking at helping people regulate their bodies, helping them in some ways make sense of their internal experiences, and then moving those, what Kurt properly labeled as implicit memories, unconscious kind of models from unconscious to more conscious patterns of behavior. So I may not really begin initially to remember my experience, but I remember this pattern of behavior, and I can begin to make some different decisions about how I want to respond to them.
I read some pretty interesting ways of talking about this, Jerry, about the difference between amateur athletes and professional athletes, and what parts of their brain they use and how much of their brains they use when they're playing their sport. And that professional athletes use significantly less of their frontal cortex while they're playing their sport than other types of athletes. And it reminded me of the job of the frontal cortex, which is prediction. So the frontal cortex is driven to automate things and to put things on, and make habits out of them and put them on autopilot, and then move them to be managed at lower areas of the brain so we can get on to the job of anticipation and prediction. So I think about this sports analogy a lot when I think about attachment and relationships, and that if you have to think about every relational interaction that you have, every moment, then you're probably not as good at it than if you were a professional and you could just not have to think about it. So if you're unfortunate enough to have gone through experiences early in childhood that have changed the procedural memory that you have about relationships, or the frames that you have about relationships, you're in a pattern of either repeating those cycles over and over again, or you have to think about them every moment that you're in those in those interactions, and that requires a lot of effort, a lot of constant effort that the brain, the frontal cortex, does not want to do. It wants to push those things down into lower areas of the brain and automate them. And so it's really kind of like you've got to compensate all the time in relationships to be able to try and get them right. And in the work world, we call it, Jerry, I think you taught me these words: conscious incompetence and conscious competence. Either you know you're not good at it, or you know you're not good at it and you want to do something about it. And that bridge is a really tough one when you get in those positions where you're like, God, I really want to do something about this, but now I have to think about it every single time. And that is exhausting. It takes a lot of effort. And I think you go in, I've seen lots of people over the years go in fits and starts with that, where at times they can do it better. And then when they get too tired or they get too overwhelmed, it's too hard to do, and they go back into the old pattern. And that becomes part of the repeating pattern of failure that gets put into their sense of self all over again. So thinking about the job of the brain and how the brain is really designed to anticipate things and to predict things, and always being really driven to create habits out of things so that they take much less effort. I mean, habits can be great and they're really efficient, and there's a great reason why we have those functions and those mechanisms to help us to deal with our environment, but they can also be the thing that keeps us trapped and not able to expand our thinking or our actions.
Wow. So I got a million things to try to unpack with you guys giving us a lot here. So let me kind of start. I think my first question is, help me understand. So memories and habits. Okay. So I do something once. I obviously have kind of maybe a weak connection there because I did it once. And the more I repeat it, I will actually build what you're saying is I build memories of repeating it over and over, and eventually I wouldn't even have to consciously think about it to do that behavior. Is that sort of what you're saying, Kurt?
Yes. In fact, the brain is driven to do that, and it will do that even if, so basically when we experience any event, our sensory systems take all that information and they collect it and put it all together, and it goes to the lower areas of our brain. And immediately what we're doing is comparing the information currently to see if there's anything in our past that is close to this.
Yeah.
And if it is, we are likely, as Jerry explained this quite well, I think, with the neuronal connections to this, that these collections of neurons then start to get fired or activated in a sequence. And that sequence becomes a habit. I mean, you can talk about a habit as a predictable sequence of behavior. You can also tie it back to a predictable sequence in our physiology.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great overlapping concepts, I think, between behavioral science and trauma science. And so even if it's not exactly the same, we are likely to look at the parts that are the same and go, oh, this is the same. Because here's the part that is the same, even if it's not the majority of the experience that's the same. We're driven to put things into models that we already know and understand and have experienced before and deal with them in the same way. So we may experience even novel situations, pick out what's familiar, and engage in the habit to deal with that novel situation, even if it's never worked in that situation before.
Yeah. And I think this powerful concept, especially when we bring that trauma-informed lens onto this, is, and I think both of you, I think Jerry hit it maybe first, then Kurt followed up with it, but, you know, understanding some of what can seem from an outside perspective of self-destructive behaviors. You know, I just know, you know, I haven't worked a lot in this field, but I have a little bit in domestic violence. And, you know, we would be working with somebody and feel good about it. And then there'd be a new boyfriend or a new girlfriend. And you just could see from the outside perspective that the pattern's going to repeat again. And I think it's a powerful thing, especially for children raised in traumatic or highly dysfunctional environments or high stress environments, that a lot of later behaviors, I believe, if I'm hearing you right, and I would agree with you if I am, can be really explained by some of those memories and patterns that they established early in childhood. We may have to take a step back to really connect the dots, and we may not have the information to connect the dots, but boy, it starts to explain why we see some high-risk behaviors that seem to be repeated over and over and over again. And Jerry, let me throw this to you. Do our memories then become almost a prison for us, for folks with these unresolved traumatic memories lingering in their brain and their body both?
So prison is an interesting concept to kind of look at, right? So when you look at what Kurt's alluding to, is that those things we need to do with repetition to survive are stored in a part of our brain that is metabolically less costly than the part of our brain that has to think about things, right? And so many of the things that we see as symptomatic, as problems, as doing it, are really at some point in somebody's history may have been their survival strategies. Things like suicidal behavior, things like engaging and becoming submissive in an abusive relationship, where at some point earlier, to assert oneself and to really stand up and leave or fight might have meant increased danger. So that what we begin to see is the symptoms, not necessarily the underlying reason for the behavioral pattern, right? That's a memory that's stored there that gets reenacted. So when we're looking and say it is a prison, well, it's a prison at the current moment because it's become maladaptive and creating problems, but it was what kept them safe and secure and protected at an earlier stage of their life experience.
Yeah.
So I think we have to both hold and honor the need for those patterns of behavior and ask them to look at them and change. So it's that dialectical dilemma that we're looking at. Is you're perfect just the way you are, but you came here to change, right? So really what we see a lot is that because it's not stored in words, I can't ask you to tell me about what your experience, what it's connected to, right? And so what we begin to do is when you hold your body in this way, what does that feel like for you? What does that feel like when you're in that versus when you're open up and you do, what does this feel like?
Yeah.
Right? And I begin to increase this awareness And through that awareness, I begin to change body patterns and reactive patterns, and those patterns begin to create some changes in my life, as opposed to always thinking that you're going to come and tell me all the bad things that happened to you. You may not even have them recorded, but they are in your body and in the way that you relate to the world. So that, you know, I want to go back to the sports analogy because I think it's a great one. There's a very famous golf instructor named Dave Peltz. And Dave Peltz has a saying. He said, practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. So if you're practicing something wrong over and over again, you're going to get it wrong. You're never going to get it right if you just keep practicing the wrong thing over and over again, right? So if I have this way of protecting myself and keeping me safe, that I submit and I do it, and now I'm in a relationship that I don't have to submit, I don't have to do it, I continue to create this pattern in my body and in my life that I become really good at. So traumatized people become really good at trauma, right? Unless we can begin to help them not just talk about having a new experience, but actually have a different experience. So that what we see is that the way that we relate is when I begin to respond to the internal state of my clients. When you do this, what does it feel like to you? And I empathize with them. And then I manage my own internal reaction to their behavior. And I begin to become more regulated and more present with them. They begin to have a different experience in the present. Not about going back to the past.
Yeah.
Is that then it begins to become integrated and resolved. And so a parent, oftentimes, we know that when they have children, the child activates old patterns of responding that the parent put that on the child. We help in this parent-child interactional process to have that adult not put their experience onto the child, but to really be open and present for the child to kind of look at it. The same thing happens with clients in therapy. The same thing happens with a really good teacher. When they can be really present with kids, they help the child contain really overwhelming experiences like aggression and impulses and maybe in some ways, self-defeating kind of behavior. So they help set limits and contain it, but they also stay relationally connected to that child at the same time to kind of do it. So that child begins to have a new experience, a new memory, and then a new pattern begins to come encoded in that. So memory becomes really important, but we can never go back and change what happened in the past. But we could change how somebody experiences that in the present about what happened in the past.
Boy, beautiful. Kurt, what do you have to add? Do you have anything to add to that? That was a great way. That was a Jerry moment right there, baby.
That's right. It's such a great concept to think about habits, and that really there is no way to undo a habit. You can create new ones. And that's and oftentimes, I mean, David Rock talks about this in his book, Quiet Leadership, about trying to go back and figure out the why of a habit. And in some ways is not useful. It may be useful down the road, especially in trauma treatment. Like there is a portion of that is part of trauma treatment. But in terms of moving forward, one of the most productive routes that you can take is to decide what you want things to be like and generate a habit in that direction. And you can generate a new habit the same way that you generated an old habit, and that is repetition. And to go through and practice it and go through and find ways to act it out, even if you do mental rehearsals. That's another way to, I mean, thinking patterns get developed the same way that I think behavioral patterns do, with repetition. And the more that we think about something, the more it becomes ingrained in our memory, and the more we take certain actions, the more they become feeling natural to us and get moved into procedural memory and become habits. So really, I think I was thinking about this concept of a treatment plan, and that what a treatment plan really is and should be is a way to illuminate the way forward, more than how to alleviate current symptomatology. Although you could certainly argue that illuminating the way forward could be the way to alleviate current suffering and current symptoms. But so many times I see that becoming the focus of what teams want to talk about and what teams want to do is what's the current symptom and how do we make it go away, more than what do we need to design in this environment and in this individual's existence and life, both present and going forward, to make it and create a new experience for that person. So I think that's a great thing that came out of what Jerry said.
You know, there's a couple of things that I think are important. One is that every time we bring up a memory, it changes that memory. So when you bring up a memory, whether it's the actual memory or it's my memory of what I remembered back then, in the context of somebody who's well-regulated, present, and attentive to my internal experiences, my experience of that memory gets altered in that moment of time to kind of look at that. I need multiple repetitions of that to create this new habit as to do it, right? And so I think it's very important, and in one of our last episodes, I think one of the people who will listen wrote in and said, what do I do with my teenager around some of these issues that you're talking about attachment? And I think the same principles hold true. When you pay attention to the teenager's internal experience, the meaning behind their behavior, not their behavior, when you empathize with what their feelings are when they're in that state, then you set limits to contain overwhelming parts of that, impulses and anger and aggression, that it's not okay to act that out. So you set limits and you regulate your own emotional reaction to it. That creates an opportunity for a new memory. And that's really hard. Both it's hard sometimes to understand the teenager's behavior. It's hard to empathize with it. It's hard to contain those really difficult impulses. And most of all, it's oftentimes hard to contain our own emotional reaction. But when we get all four of those in line, we have an opportunity to create new meaning and new experiences for people that allow them to heal and recover and have a different sense of themselves, different sense of the world that we live in and the people in that world.
So I want to, because that's really key. And the fascinating piece about memories to me, and what we're seeing with a lot of the best practice trauma treatments coming out, is again, creating this safe, regulated state that we have, and then recalling the memory in that. So a memory that would normally freak us out, we have enough coping skills, parasympathetic nervous system strength, however we want to go about it, to really, in some ways, to simplify it, breathe through the memory and not let it kind of take control over us, which I think is a really powerful step for psychology. And when you look at EMDR and other things, very cool. I wonder, as we kind of approach the end of our time together here, though, what if I'm not a therapist? What if I'm a teacher? What if I'm a foster parent who might, and I think some of us would caution people who don't have the training to go talk to people about their trauma, because if you have a large caseload and you have everybody talk about their traumatic experiences, you may have the worst month in the history of the helping profession. But what would you suggest as sort of, I'm working with somebody, whether they're a kid in my classroom, maybe a foster kid, and I don't have the skill set to go into the memories. What are some of the first things that I can do to help that person who may not be ready to go into mental health services or have that as the access? What can I do to help them start to get out of that, what we call a prisoner habit that trauma might have caused?
I think I can offer one thing to start with, and that is a memory of mine back maybe 10 years ago, when I first started hearing a lot about trauma treatment. I was working in a residential facility at that time, and I'd be in these team meetings, and the people who usually had placed the child with us would have placed them there to deal with their trauma or to get treatment for their trauma. And so one of the questions that would get asked most frequently in progress review meetings was, well, have they processed their trauma yet? And that was what got pushed in those team meetings quite a bit. And without, I think, a little better understanding of how that process worked, I think a lot of teams got and felt pushed to ask about traumatic experiences a lot, and to that kind of thought of that was our job, that if we weren't asking about it and if we weren't pushing, that we weren't doing our jobs correctly. Now looking back on that, I can clearly say to anybody in any of those meetings, that's really not what the main portion of our job is. That our job is to create a pleasant experience and a positive environment that has lots of repetition. It's very rewarding. It's very engaging, and that is our job. And that when the child is ready, they will talk about it. But our job is to create a space in which they can have a different experience, that they can start to create new habits, new ways of interacting with the world. And that's a much larger part of trauma treatment than asking about trauma, or, as they say, processing the trauma. So I think if I were somebody who is in a classroom or a supervisor on a residential unit or caseworker, I would kind of disavow myself from the thought that my job is to help people to talk about their trauma. It may be to listen when they want to talk, and that very well may be my job. And most of the time that probably is about where my job is to listen, try and understand, to try and connect with their internal state. But it certainly doesn't need to be something that I would need to be worried about asking about trauma.
And I think a huge step that, like you said, we've just made in recent years. I think we're getting there, and it's sort of counterintuitive at some point that we can help heal something without making somebody talk about it, or at least initially, which I think is good. Jerry, what would you add to that?
Oh, what would I add to that? What I would add to it is that Daniel Siegel and so many others really aren't talking about desensitizing or taking the juice just out of a memory. They're talking about integration, right? So that we begin to move towards integration. And the way that our brains maximize integration is when we have somebody with us who has the ability to be reflective and not reactive. And so if I were to give a teacher or a parent or even a paraprofessional a skill, it's the capacity to be reflective. And then I would sit them down with somebody who's their supervisor and not ask them and tell them, here's what you do and here's the 6 things you do. I would ask them to sit down and start to tell me what their experience was like with the person that they're dealing with, so that they become reflective. That when we develop our own frontal cortical capacities to reflect on our experience, we maximize the experiences for those we interact to do the same. So that I would say that, along with what Kurt talked about not getting so focused on that traumatic story, but really focused on how can I sit and be reflective, whether it's the parent to the child or a teacher, and ask them, so what's it like having this really disruptive kid in your classroom? Once they tell their story and feel heard and valued and appreciated, they're much more in a chance to be able to be reflective with the child than if I'm giving them advice on how they're supposed to manage that child.
Yeah.
So that when we create healthy relational interactions with each other, we maximize the ability of the adults that are with our clients, our children, to maximize their capacity to be reflective with them, which helps them to grow. That's
absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're hearing again from us, which is just a common, powerful theme, relationships and being healthy in that relationship. The one thing that I would add, because all these are great, and I think we would probably throw out a few more, but our time's getting short, is one of the things, Jerry mentioned this as well, is that we create through our memories this narrative. And one of the things that I've seen coming out of the research is one of the devastating effects of trauma is it kind of tells us that we're not a person of worth a lot of times. That why would somebody abuse somebody if they had any value? If they were a decent human being. And you know, this has come to the forefront, and especially work I've done with survivors of child abuse, especially sexual abuses or actual physical abuse, as well as they've told me over and over, I feel like I deserve this. And that's just the power of that. And so one thing that I always really encourage folks to do is, you know, find what that kid, what that adult, what that person is good at. Find their, I love the term island of competency. What is this person good at? And maybe if you're a teacher, it may not necessarily be an academic subject to begin with, but are they good at something? Can they clean up after recess? What little thing can they do, and celebrate that thing? Because as long as people don't think that they're a worthy individual, again, they can kind of keep stuck in all these patterns and habits. And, you know, a lot of times later on, they become addictions, and that can devastate people's lives and have that long-term effect of trauma. And so some really good, great suggestions here. I know we're going to, memory will be, like everything else we talk about, part of future conversations as well. But we're right at time. So Jerry, Kurt, thanks again. Great discussion. I want to thank everybody listening. We'll put some show notes. If you haven't seen the video of us, it's always kind of hilarious to watch us actually talk and me move my hands all about. You can find all that good stuff at traumainformedlens, all one word.org, and see that there. So next week we got an exciting episode. We actually have our first special guest. So we're going to add a fourth voice to the conversation and start to talk about trauma's impact on our health. Look at it a little bit from a public health perspective with a really great expert and friend of mine, Holly Hansen from the Department of Health in Iowa, and really take a look at some of the research she's been doing about adverse childhood experiences and the impact on our health later on in adulthood. So stay tuned for that, and everybody have a great week, and we'll see you next week on the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Thanks everybody for your time.